Hiram is played by
Richard Serra.
Yeah,
and that Hiram was believed to have the answer to the greatest secrets, and refused to divulge these secrets to the apprentices, and was killed for that. And so here we are in the fourth degree of the order, which is described by a locked-in sheep, again indigenous to the Isle of Man. This ram is sort of splayed open into a kind of five-socketed terminal.
It's actually right here.
Right, which could function like a game, and the game is played much like the Highland game of the caber toss. And I guess finally on the fifth screen is Richard Serra throwing hot Vaseline into the parapet wall. And this, in some ways, would be the time clock of the game, that the jelly would run down this trough that circles down the parapet wall down to where the chorus line is kicking the wall repeatedly. And the game would need to be solved before that jelly drips down to the end. Like with every level in this order sequence, I wanted an allegorical representative of Cremaster 5 in this case. And Richard's thrown lead pieces, I think, have always been the clearest manifestation of that kind of, for me, that kind of notion of taking this sort of undifferentiated mass and, willfully differentiating it in one gesture.
I think we then better go back to the beginning and say, first of all, what is a cremaster? Mm-hmm. And how did this begin as a sort of metaphorical idea, this idea of resolution?
Mm-hmm. One of the ways I was thinking about the entire cycle at that time was by looking at the model of the way that the reproductive system develops in the fetus, and that for 7 weeks there's no visual difference between the male and female reproductive system, and that if I had to say that the project existed in any sort of developmental state, it would be pregenital. I think that, particularly in the time that number 4 was made and number 1 was made, I was sort of thinking about how that sort of pregenital state could be its starting point.
The cremaster is a muscle, by the way, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, which I mean, to ask it to play this role is completely ridiculous. But I think what was intriguing is that if the internal organs are in this position that is, similar within a male and female fetus, that what would govern the movement of those two organs? If the conflict of the story is the movement of those two organs, then there needs to be a governing force, and therefore that would define its conflict somehow, and that if there was a muscle in place that would do that, it would be the cremaster muscle, which wraps around the cord that connects the internal reproductive organ. In the case of the male, the adult male, and it pulls the testes back up into the body when the body's cold.
I mean, but here, this was the first, Cremaster 4, so it was the first film, and this was the first major work.
I think this piece was an attempt to take those three factions and to create a kind of a conglomerate of the three factions, that there would be that the ascending team would be represented by the yellow bike, and the house itself would in some way be the Lockton field, or the green field, and that the Lockton candidate at the beginning of Cremaster 4 starts looking at his reflection in the mirror.
This is the role you play in Cremaster 4.
And he inspects these sort of sockets in his head, these 4 sockets that could give rise to 4 horns, and could give him that ability to sort of occupy that space between the ascended and descended state, like a kind of an impossible space in between those 2 things. And I got interested in how a sculpture could exist that would define that space between his reflection and the sort of real fact of the Lockton ram that was on the other side of the island, that he sort of needed to sort of find. And so he digs his way through the earth beneath the island.
In the movie, you sort of do a tap dance on this pier.
Right.
First, you're looking at yourself in the mirror. You do a tap dance to the pier. You fall into the water. You actually did fall into the water, right?
Yeah.
And then underwater, you find this hole to crawl through.
Right.
Yeah. Which was this?
Which I think is probably one of many examples in the films where the landscape, where the architecture is asked to be anatomical in some way, and
it looks like intestines or something.
Yeah.
Let's look in the next
number 5.
Yeah, room. I don't know what you'd say, which is the sculpture for 5. And then maybe we can look at some of the later sculptures.
Great. One of the first images that came up while writing Cremaster 5 was that the idea that that this character called the Giant, or her Giant, would I guess he ends up being one of 3 characters that I played that I sort of considered the same character, 3 manifestations of the same character.
When you say her giant, you mean Ursula Andress's giant.
Right.
She's the sort of...
Right, she's the main character, the Queen of Chain. And Chain comes from the Lanchet Bridge, which was the first bridge over the Danube in Budapest.
The Chain Bridge.
The Chain Bridge. And so that within the bathhouse that we worked in Budapest, there were two hot pools, and they were separated by 2 degrees in temperature, and that I was interested in having the Giant straddle the saddle between the 2 baths, and that the plan of the Gellert bath, which this piece mimics, the saddle between the 2 pools, became a kind of anatomical reflection of the queen, who was sitting on a throne theoretically above this saddle. And in some way it became her perineum.
In the film, actually, there's this rather remarkable thing in which she's sitting in the opera house, but then looking sort of